University of Nottingham. Welcome everyone to the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute Malaysia seminar series wow, this is the only one that we're doing for this semester as I'll be away. I'm the director of UoNARI Malaysia and my name is Gate Cheng Pu. And today what I'll be doing is I'll be chairing the conversation on authoritarianism in Asia with a special focus on Iran and Burma. And today I'm very pleased to welcome two speakers with different regional specializations to be on this panel. Dr. Julia Rocknefar, speaking on Iran, and Dr. Elliot Press-Freeman on Burma. But before I introduce our speakers, let me just give some background about the reason for this panel. Last September, civil protests broke out in Iran after Mahsa Amini, a Kurdish woman who had been arrested for wearing her hijab improperly, died in police custody. And the Western media picked the story up and framed it as a backlash against women by the Islamic Republic. And here too, some of our students who were not aware of the ongoing issues may regard it as such. We then thought up to ourselves that comparatively, we have another similar ongoing situation of civil unrest and protests and authoritarianism in a neighboring country, Burma. So this panel wants to provide a historical, socioeconomic, political context for our broader understanding of how authoritarianism refuses to loosen its grip and instead is making advances in these two countries. Beyond the quite different facade of months-long protests in Iran and ongoing civil war in Myanmar, I think this conversation will show some striking similarities. So let me introduce our speakers. We've got Julia Rocknefar, who's an assistant professor at the School of Politics, History, and International Relations, my colleague at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. And her specialty is on Iran and international security. We're also really pleased to welcome Elliot Press-Freeman, who is now currently at the Department of Anthropology at Yale University. He has conducted long-term fieldwork in Myanmar and has a book coming out from Stanford University Press this year on Burmese subaltern political thought as deduced from an extended ethnography of activism and contentious politics in Burma's semi-authoritarian setting. Elliot also has a book project on Rohingya political subjectivity amidst dislocation and mass violence, with a particular focus on their maneuvers in the context of post-sovereign governmental regimes that incorporate human rights discourse, humanitarian care or exclusion, and biopolitical regulation. So we're really looking forward to seeing those books coming out. So just let me explain a bit of the structure. We'll begin first with a 5-minute introduction from each of our speakers. And after that, we'll have more of a dialogue or conversation on several issues. So we'll be comparing the two states along the following lines. We'll be looking at the political economy. What are the underlying economic reasons? We'll talk about the role of women. We'll talk about maybe trans-ethnic solidarity, the youth and revolution, and lastly, political violence. How prominent is a role? How prominent does political violence play in both countries? So without further ado, let's start with, and then of course, hopefully we'll have a bit of time left for questions. Okay, so without further ado, let's start with Julia giving us an introduction about what's been happening in Iran. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Wow, well, this is an unexpected success in terms of attendance, but I think people might be feeling aloof about attending any events since the Ramadan started. But I'm just returning back from a conference in Istanbul, and we've had a pretty much similar situation over there, although there that's motivated by the fact that after the earthquakes, people are mostly studying online. So not so much of those attending things face to face as well. I don't know what our students excuse, because I'm also, today my talk is prepared with them in mind in the first turn. Next week we are talking about Iran in our course, and I wanted this to be a kind of a warm-up. Gig, if I may have maybe 10 minutes instead of 5, if that's possible. I prepared some of the introduction, but I'll skip some parts. Try to focus on the major things, and we can return to my basic stuff, I guess, later on. So let me share my screen. Please let me know at any point if you can't see what I'm showing or hear me. So can you see the presentation now? Yep. Okay, well, my most important disclaimer would be that, well, I wanted to start from that the idea of comparing the two and trying to share these experiences of what Iran and Myanmar are going through right now. I found it very fascinating, and indeed in the preliminary stages of preparing to this seminar, I think we noticed that there are some similarities despite the two country cases being quite different. My disclaimer here is that I'm not speaking as a political activist, because I know that things are pretty sensitive now in both Myanmar and Iran. So I'm only highlighting things as an academic, things that interest me. So I prepared a little bit of introduction on Iran for you, which I'll go over it like really briefly in a couple of sentences. Iran has been a kind of a paradox since the so-called Islamic Revolution of 1979, when Iran from a Shah's regime became an Islamic Republic of Iran. But Islamic and Republic, the combination of the two in one name already raises questions about its nature, because some would see it as a paradox. Islamic State would mean that there is and that's one of the premises of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that there is a certain theological leadership, as it is led by the regime of a religious jurist, faqih, the regime of and the concept of Velayat al-Faqih proposed by Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the revolution of 1979. But republic would imply that there is a certain degree of how people render influence into the power system. So that has been existing with that and many other paradoxes for several decades now, since 1979. And I highlighted some of those paradoxes, like, some arguments supporting both sides in the Islamic Republic, the Islamic part of it, where you can see here listed a number of very important competences that are all concentrated in the hands of the supreme leader, that very faqih, the religious jurist, the rahbar, another alternative term for this position. They're concentrated in his hands, and he wields enormous power while being an practically unelected. It's only the second supreme leader that we have since the time of the Islamic Revolution, who was installed by the Assembly of Experts, another body of male-dominated, pretty much aging body that is supposed to elect and monitor him, but in practice doesn't really monitor him, because it can't really impeach him practically. He appoints many important people on many important positions within the state, which concerns media, but also judiciary. He appoints directly and a half directly and the other half indirectly to the judiciary members of the Guardian Council, which is responsible for vetting candidates for the elections, which means that the candidates that people vote in elections go through an additional an additional vetting process, which is based on a number of criteria, some of which include religious credentials and loyalty to the Islamic Republic. And on the Republican side, there are duplicate institutions, such as parliaments, judiciary with high involvement of the religious elite, and of course the executive, which is headed by the president. Currently it's Ibrahim Raisi, elected in 2021. There is also double structure to armed forces. There is an army, a remnant of the Shah's era, but there's also, familiar to all of you, I'm sure, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or Sepah Pasdaran, which was established after the Islamic Revolution. But also, observers, attentive Iran watchers would say that there is a vibrant civil society that exists underneath. And that vibrant civil society, although we might not see it as much, has been performing some resistance. And I think what we've noticed is that the more control the government tried to exert over especially more of a private domain, which domain that people consider private, the more spots for resistance people found. That would be fair to say not only for Iran's example, I'm sure, for example, for dressing, for the matters of conversion or faith profession. You cannot, for example, convert out of Islam. In what comes to the dress code, that we've seen pretty much a lot. We've seen protests and civil activities. Protests, the previous most important protest was the Bloody November protest in 2019, which spilled over in 2020. And the previous ones were held in 2009 after Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected for the second term. But people are also, especially in the course of those protests, people formulate their demands into slogans, and those demands contain demands for women's rights, freedom of expression, rights of religious minorities, also ethnic minorities, which Iran has plenty. There is also existence of underground theater, dance publishers that you can find books that are actually banned. And Iran has seen increase in divorce rates and overall change of mores for the past years or decades. For the past decade, you can say so, where, for example, young people start living together. That's not allowed, but it's becoming more and more widespread. So to me, it's a kind of a challenge to the existing system and this attempt to control the private domains. The protest of 2022 ends, even though we're talking about authoritarianism, but we are using this protest as a case study to illustrate what is happening with Iran's regime, its stability, its agenda, and agenda of the people who are participating in the protests. They were triggered by the death of a young Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, in custody of the morality police for the wrongfully wearing hejab. And that served as a trigger. That wasn't the reason, but the trigger definitely. And I guess we'll have an opportunity to talk about it. What is the agenda behind it? So I'll just skip that part for now. We've been into the protest for 6 months. We're still counting. There are numbers unofficially of over 500 people killed, about 20,000 arrested, although some of them were let go, 4 people executed so far. And the demands became more vocal, the slogans that people are chanting on the streets. Now they're targeting directly the supreme leader. I stated resignation there, but not only resignation, but one of the classical ones, the ones that were applicable to Israel and America more often in the past, death to Israel, death to America, Mark Bar. Now it is applied to the supreme leader, Mark Bar Khamenei. Here I just brought up the pictures of several people who were shot in the course of the protest, including the 10-year-old boy, Kian Pirfalak. You can see him in the middle. 4 men executed so far. Some are also lingering on a death row. Some were already convicted. Some are still awaiting. We also have seen in the course of the protest, there are some strange events that started to happen in Iran with poisoning of school students, girls, who took part especially actively in protesting, filming themselves dancing, taking off their headscarves. You can see in one of the pictures here. And the government was criticized for dragging feet on this incident, on investigating it, because it started happening in multiple cities, not only in the capital city of Tehran, but all over the country, with girls being hospitalized. And the government has been criticized not only for dragging feet on this case, but also for comparison between other cases. For example, on the top left corner, you can see the man who is holding his wife's head. I think he was convicted eventually and given 7 years in prison for this brutal murder, while, for example, these events are not being even given diligent attention and not being properly investigated. People are not being given answers, and of course they are afraid to send their children to school. The similar incident we had in 2009 when there was some petty crime, some petty crime that even the perpetrators were either acquitted or they were let go. And then there was a wave of acid throwing at women. And the government again didn't give it, back in 2009, it didn't give it due attention. So you can see how much importance the government puts on different cases, especially those related to, when it's related to dissent. There is a number, and we can discuss it maybe later. I will keep the slide to myself, where here I was going to discuss a little bit more at length an answer to the question of how we can assess the stability of the existing political regime, if there is any threat to this regime, if there is a so-called revolutionary situations, because we've been through a number of protests so far, and at each and every one of them, it could have been said that no, a revolution is not another revolution or counter-revolution to the revolution of 1979 is not going to occur. But now that's probably the time to discuss it more seriously. And I brought up a number of criteria suggested by an Iranian political sociologist here, so we can discuss it more at length. Then there is an issue of leadership. I think, Geik, if you could ask me later, I will also talk, because it's one of the criteria that I'm discussing, and the international implications of it, where, if to sum it up, with the process ongoing for the past 6 months, with at the same time Iran is not being able to mend things in the international arena, although for the reasons that do not depend on Tehran itself so much, to mend things with P5+1 in the first turn, in terms of reestablishing the JCPOA, the so-called Iran nuclear deal. It has been looking for other outlets, for other alliances, in order to prove its legitimacy to its own people at home and also at the international arena. And there we've seen emerging a tsunami of news about the nascent strategic relationship between Iran and Russia. The foreign minister of Iran again traveled to Russia yesterday, I think, and again they restated that they are going to sign some strategic partnership agreement. It has been sending, in support of Russia, it has been sending drones, the UAVs, to be used in Ukraine, which also soured its possible reconciliation over the nuclear deal. So we could see a new alliance of authoritarian states forming between the nations of the so-called global south. For example, the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the rapprochement deal, was mediated by China as the last mediator in the chain of those who participated. I think I'll stop it here, and I'll be very happy to cover what I didn't manage to cover now, not to take away time from Elliot.
All right, I'll jump in then and share my screen. When I found out, Julia, you had those nice slides, I figured I should provide some of my own. So they're not as nicely put together, but I tried to like cobble together some that I've been referencing recently, and so hopefully they kind of work. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the uprising, the Ayedobon, the ongoing revolution against the attempted coup that was in February 1st, 2021. So we just passed the 2-year mark. And I say attempted coup because, you know, it's still kind of unclear how the coup will play out. And I think the revolutionaries who are in many places, perhaps even within the military, are still trying to make this a reality. So it's something to kind of stress that what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of ongoing and still unfolding. And I think quite like very devastating, of course, for what has happened to Myanmar, but also a little bit hopeful. And I'll talk about why that is. So just to give a little bit of context, this recent catastrophe of this coup took place about 2 years ago, and the Burmese people were not impressed and came out onto the street by the millions, but couldn't stay there because of the massive violence that the military bestowed upon them as they resisted. And so since the sort of heady days of the first month of protests and then the brutal 2 months of March and April 2021, there's been this kind of like low-grade, low-simmering civil war, you could call it, and really interesting in the sense that it's not just a Yangon or urban phenomenon. This is a spread to the area that's called Anya, which means like the upriver. So places like Sagaing and Mandalay and Magway divisions kind of in the center of the country, sometimes called the dry zone, who've traditionally not really been that involved in politics for a lot of different reasons, have taken up arms. And it's a pretty tough spot to be in because there's not a lot of hill cover as there is in many other parts of the country. So there have been a lot of pretty brutal casualties on the part of those folks. We shouldn't leave Chin State out as well, which is in that region. So a little bit about the historical context when I say this is not the first catastrophe. Myanmar had a constitutional government after the transition from the colonial era, but it wasn't really able to cohere itself into its sort of peripheries, and there were communist and ethnic insurgencies from the very start. So by the 1950s, it was called the Rangoon government, mostly because it didn't have control of much beyond Rangoon. As this constitutional government failed in 1962, one of the first military coups, unless you count the mild trial run in 1958, occurred, in which a sort of kleptocratic regime claimed to be looking out for the kind of socialism or the Burmese way to socialism, but mostly just started to enrich itself to become stronger as a sort of vast, I kind of like think of it as a mafia. And I don't mean that to disparage the mafia, I guess. What I mean by that is that as an organized crime syndicate, it tends to eschew some of the trappings that most states we take for granted in most states. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes almost contrasting with Julia about how she described how more control leads to more resistance, and how in a Myanmar context, because of the different form of the state, it actually is kind of sometimes difficult to be an activist. But before I get there, in 2011, at the point where many of us thought that, the military started to pivot towards a more, you called it like a disciplined road to democracy, and started to seem like they were pretty serious about letting go of some of the reins, happy to withdraw a bit from politics, having entrenched themselves so deeply into society that they couldn't be really avoided. And so during those 10 years that ended in 2021 February, Aung San Suu Kyi, at the time, or I guess still Nobel laureate and leader of the opposition, and the military kind of had to forge a elite pact. And some people think that she capitulated too much to the military. Other people think she didn't do enough. But the point is that at that point, it really seemed like things were pretty good for the military because they managed to recede from being responsible directly for a lot of the political issues in the country. And Aung San Suu Kyi was able to take, the blame for things like the Rohingya genocide, which, she unfortunately and shamefully did defend the country against accusations of genocide at the International Court of Justice, something she didn't have to do, but it was the military that had executed that. And so as a result, you have this military that things were looking pretty good for them. They managed to continue to run a lot of their dominate the political economy and many of the extraction schemes and Burma's natural resources, but not have to deal with the problem of governing. And so a lot of us, one of the tasks was to make sense of the current moment. And I think many people are still confused by what happened during the coup. Why did the military decide to do this, given that things actually seem so good for them? So one of the things I do want to stress is that when we talk about authoritarianism, the sort of need to disaggregate it a little bit and think about the different expressions and valences, the different infrastructures and institutions that could define it. And I think one thing that I certainly assumed before I moved there a long time ago, 2004 and 2005 was the first time I lived there, was that the state was a sort of totalitarian one that displayed and deployed a sort of desire to reach into every crevice of existence and surveil and manage people's lives. I showed up at the airport expecting that, and instead there were barely a state holding together there. And so, but at the same time, you also have a state that can execute a coup and commit a genocide. So what I want to highlight here is the way that the Myanmar state is strong in some ways and really weak in others. And it ends up kind of congealing into a really interesting, weird apparatus. So it has a sort of, it's like radically present when it kills people and it, commits genocide, but it's radically absent in a lot of cases. And so what I mean by this in terms of its absence is that it wasn't particularly accountable, and there were a lot of internecine fights that one could pursue, that different groups pursued as they tried to get by in this new sort of neoliberal moment during the transition. But then it was also radically present in its ability to smack people down and to commit the coup. So what do I mean by absence? So I spent a couple of years working with activists, and the challenge of the activists was actually much more difficult than you might imagine, because often the state would not respond to complaint letters. Its agents would tell protesters to finish up a protest quickly so as to not make a scene. It will not rearrest a protester when this is San Sanu, she took off her shirt and burned it. This is right after she had been convicted for 52 months in prison. She basically held this impromptu press conference in the middle of the court compound, and all these different reporters had gathered around her. And yet the lower level members of the state said, it's okay. Let's just pretend this didn't happen. And this isn't just the police arm of the state, but also the sort of more infrastructural part, the sort of governmental or biopolitical part, in the sense that it has all these administrative forms, but it doesn't know what they do or how to use them. It has these ethnic classifications, but it barely knows them. It can't ascribe ethnicity to people. It has ID cards, the Mapon 10, but it doesn't insist anyone carry them. It will give over certain localized state functions to right-wing Buddhist organizations. So it actually gives up much of its governance ability. And as a result, one of the challenges of the activists was to kind of somehow presence the state, to get it to show up, to then be able to deliver messages to it, to be able to construct different publics who can hear demands made against it and can start to imagine politics otherwise, because people hadn't really experienced this, that kind of form of demand on the state very often. Okay, so the Burmese activists, and I think what we can see this going on in the anti-coup uprising right now, they have to essentially deploy or mimic the state's own presence and absence. And what I mean by that is that activists can't be completely absent. They can't leave the country. They have to stay to fight, but they can't go straight into the teeth of the military, or they'll risk a suicide. So there's this sort of game of cat and mouse that we're seeing play out now in Myanmar as the people who are still involved in the revolution try to continue to fight it, but also know that they don't have superior firepower, so have to kind of wage guerrilla warfare. I'll skip over this, but I do want to talk about how a lot of activist life, or life in general in Myanmar, is surviving a sort of structural violence, and activists have to elaborate an alternative to it. And they spend a lot of time recovering from violence, quietly organizing others, and gradually transforming, trying to transform local communities into self-reliant ones. And just on a last point, because I know we kind of wanted to talk about this, this is a little bit necessary because the international doesn't seem to be as interested in Myanmar as it is in other places. And this has spurred a lot of kind of critique and lamentation, I think, on the part of Myanmar, who feel quite abandoned by the world. But I also wonder if it has a lot to do with the sort of choices that Aung San Suu Kyi made, because the international tends to like clean stories of good and evil. But after the Rohingya genocide and the Aung San Suu Kyi endorsing that so forcefully, it almost seems like the international has decided to turn its back on the sort of David and Goliath story of the Myanmar people against the military. Now, another question that remains open is, to what extent does that matter? Does the international's gaze, does its willingness to see the Myanmar struggle, would it matter materially if the United States, for instance, recognized the national unity government? But those are kind of open questions that I think the revolution itself wants to or needs to consider. I'll leave it there for now, and can start to address some of the other questions that I know Ike has.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. It's just, thank you, Elliot. That's fascinating. Got a lot of questions, but I think maybe we'll just go with the original plan first, and maybe if you both could address the underlying economic reasons for the two events or catalysts. Let's start with Julia, and bearing in mind that we have a lot more to touch on, try to limit it to 3-4 minutes.
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief, and thank you so much to Elliot for his presentation. I would say it would be very redundant for us to say that there are majorly economic reasons to the current uprising, though they've been pretty significant, and the situation has been exacerbating. Iran has been the most sanctioned country in the world until February last year, when Russia took over. But Iran is no Russia. It's a smaller country, and it was less connected to the world since the time that it was sanctioned after 1979, the embassy takeover, and it had much more difficulties in coping with the protest. With the economic sanctions that were tightening and tightening. There were sanctions over sanctions. There are direct sanctions imposed by, those imposed by the UN Security Council. They mostly concern weapon supplies or dual-use items. They don't really touch on economy that much. But for example, the American sanctions, EU sanctions, and American secondary sanctions, which mean that the United States can sanction any other agent engaging in activity with Iran, especially if it surpasses a certain amount of the dealing. That hit Iran pretty hard. It learned to circumvent sanctions to an extent, for example, to still sell its oil by using different tankers under different flags, but it has hit the country hard. However, the understanding within the country is that sanctions had less impact rather than unskillful and sophisticated governance, rather than the government which is corrupt, a government after another government, and there is a deep state. There is a high control over the economy on the part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Currently, the dollar hit again some unprecedented levels of, yeah, I think 50,000 to 1, and it definitely makes people's life hard, even though, of course, they learn to live with less import, a lot of, especially food-wise. So Iran still produce a lot of food on its own. It's if we compare it to Lebanon, it's in less dire situation. But it has been that the pie, the piece of bread, the loaf of bread that people can put on their table has been shrinking and shrinking with the rise in prices. So, of course, with the inability of the government to provide the welfare package, the social package, the unrest on for other reasons, like the lack of political rights, the lack of freedoms, and far not only the dressing rules, it started to unravel. So the situation is pretty dire, but it's not the only reason for the protests.
Thanks. Ali?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the issues about the political economy is that the Myanmar is very focused on natural resource extraction, and the military tends to control certain aspects of that in its holding companies. And one of the things why this is relevant for the coup is that it tends to insulate them from a lot of like general strikes and other things that the population could do, because relatively speaking, people just aren't necessary for the social reproduction of the military. On the other hand, they have a big institution to keep afloat. And some people were speculating that one of the reasons for the coup is you essentially have this like vast machine that is constantly needing to retire older generals and allow younger ones to move up the ranks. Now, the older generals in the past would find sinecures in different places, but in the current, the idea was that during this quasi-democratic moment, they would win elections and then go, essentially retire into those positions. Now, because of the first past the post system in Myanmar's constitution that they wrote, they end up winning almost no seats, well, very few seats compared to what they expected. And so there's a sort of blockage where the people can't go up and the younger people can't rise to, and so there's a sort of crisis within the ranks. That's one argument. I don't know if there's much evidence for that. It's all speculative at this point. Another argument, a political economic argument, is that I think Sean Turnell, who is a imprisoned economist advisor to the NLD, he was in jail for a couple of years, has been associated with this theory. I'm not sure if he's articulated it himself, but there was an idea that the NLD would try to break up some of the large holding companies and some of the crony-linked businesses. And the military said, no, you're not going to do that. And then, executed a coup in order to foreclose that option. I don't see any evidence of that, especially given what Suu Kyi said about the cronies over her time in office, and the fact that she never pursued any pro-poor policies, never any real economic policies at all to speak of, unless ones that were written by the World Bank, which tend to be pretty, amenable to sorry, it's raining where I am, so I hope the thunder isn't disrupting. Very amenable to capital, and as a result, quite amenable to the status quo. So it's a little bit hard to decipher the reasons for the coup and how the political economy played into them, but I'm sure it's in the mix somehow.
Okay. So what about the role of women? What role did they play, and what space for feminism is there in both countries? I'm sure I know that they've been active in both places. Julia?
Yeah. Well, as we had multiple discussions with Gabe, with other colleagues as well on the issue. Is it an anti-hijab revolution, anti-hijab protest, or is there more to it? Of course, there is more to it, and time showed, the past 6 months definitely showed. There were other smaller scale kind of actions of protest before. For example, there was a My Stealthy Freedom launched by the Iranian living in Iranian in opposition, living abroad, Masih Alinejad, but it was picked up by women inside of Iran as well. Women standing in the streets, taking off their headscarf, holding them on the stick. Some of them actually went missing back then. So there were episodes of resistance here and there to the compulsory dressing rule, and I think that's where the women's role comes more prominent. But that is rather symbolic to a larger layer of problems that is out there. First, the closest to it is overall compulsory dressing rule, and again, it's already seen as an encroachment into the private domain, the morality police existing there. Then the dressing rules are applied not only to women, but also to men. For example, you are not supposed to wear shorts or something revealing your belly. And you can also be held by the morality police as a man for breaching those rules. But usually, of course, it's applied to women, especially in terms of compulsory headscarf. Although we've seen that how much more loose the hijab rules, I mean, in practice, they became. Nevertheless, the Gasht Irshad, the morality police, was still there. It is still there. And there are men who object to these rules applied to women. There, I guess we can also count it under feminism, but I see it as a larger demand for this private domain to be left alone, for the freedom of choice. So the current protest where women are fighting against the compulsory hijab is not a struggle against hijab per se, but it's a struggle against the mandatory hijab. And then even though it started with Mahsa Amini's death after she was held in custody by the morality police, there is again so much more to it than just a woman being detained because of breaching the hijab or the mandatory dressing rules. It's more a reflection of a demand for justice, for the rule of law. And what it showed, that rule of law is non-existent, that you cannot demand you cannot expect for your child, for your girlfriend or wife to be safe in the custody of morality police. And even if we give credit to the government and imagine that nothing happened on their part and she had some underlying condition whatsoever, then why they were not prompt in investigating it, why people who resisted the investigation were not sacked. So you imagine the situation that's the overall, it's a path, it's a chain of events, it's a path, it's a process. It's not a single event that happened and just triggered that, and it's not just a hijab, it's not just women, it's overall the lack of law and the encroachment of the government into the private domain that people are not ready to tolerate, especially now with the ever-shrinking welfare package.
So the protests were led from the very start by women, mostly young factory workers who came from the industrial zones and were involved in some of the protests from the first days. And then many of the leaders who were featured include women, including Itin Zamong and Esther Nezo, who were young ethnic minority women who were at the front of some of those first protests. And this isn't, I think, just tokenistic. I think that there has been a lot of discussion during the sort of revolutionary period, if we can call it that, of sort of self-examination on the part of Myanmar society. And one of the things that has been, or people have been trying to deconstruct, is a sort of toxic cocktail of ethnic chauvinism, militarism, and paternalism or patriarchy, I guess you could say. And different people are arguing for different, the importance of the relative variables, but there's been an important kind of aspect of the movement is, when we're victorious, the word in Burmese for when and if is the same. And so it's sometimes a little tricky to differentiate, but when the revolution is successful, like, will we go back to, January 31st, 2021? No, that was not a recipe for liberation either. And so I think that activists and everyday people are making use of this time in the revolution to have conversations amongst themselves about what kind of changes need to happen within Myanmar society, one of which being the sort of dismantling of the sort of structure of chauvinism, militarism, and paternalism.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to this again, but I think it nicely leads into trans-ethnic solidarity, whether there's any kind of mobilization. Maybe we'll start with you, Elliot, since you're here on. Has there been any kind of mobilization stemming from ethnic exclusion or a more cohesive uprising for national goals?
Yeah, I think even the very question of what does it mean to be, what kind of nation are we fighting for? So I think, and is the nation worth fighting for, has been something that's been put back on the table. During the transition period, there was a sort of policing of the outer dimensions or the range of discourse, a sort of let's not rock the boat kind of thing, even though the NLD did not seem to be making many overtures towards the ethnic minorities or ethnic nationalities in the country, in many ways aligning themselves with the military in the national ceasefire agreement and various, it's something called the Second Panglong Conference. There was a sort of hope on the part of many people that this was just tactical. Like, look, she has to not get outmaneuvered by the military. And I do say she because one of Aung San Suu Kyi's underappreciated failings is her complete inability to delegate any authority in her political party. So she ruled it like an authoritarian and brooked no dissent and had to be involved in every single decision, which was kind of short-sighted because she's not going to be in power forever. And as demonstrated right now, she's in house arrest again and will likely be there for a long time, unfortunately. And new leaders will have to emerge, but they certainly won't come from within the NLD because she basically cultivated a group of sycophants for the last 30 years. Now, that's a slight aside that isn't really addressing the issue at hand, which is that issue of to what extent would a non-Burma, that's the majority, want to be involved in the revolution. And I think on one hand, people do feel like they're part of Myanmar. On the other hand, they feel pretty betrayed by the NLD, and also obviously they've never been friends with the what's called the Sitat, the military. And so I think what the sort of discourses that had been policed during the transition, don't rock the boat, things will get better, are now back on the table. Things like, not just pretty radical autonomy within a federal structure, but even secession, And so at the time of the coup, I think a lot of ethnic minorities almost looked at it with sort of bemused contempt. Like, this is a Burma on Burma issue, and to think that we are going to get involved misunderstands how poorly we've been treated over the last 70 years. On the other hand, I do think there are people who do feel committed to Myanmar despite the negative experiences they've had, and the fact that the military has been so awful to everyone, even physically awful, like in terms of the atrocities of the last 2 years, has kind of created a sort of position in which everyone kind of identifies with the common enemy. And so you saw a lot of Burma people, and I use Burma being the majority, making sort of public statements of apology to the Danyenta, the ethnic minority peoples, or even the Rohingya, saying, look, we didn't know that that it could be this bad. We didn't trust your stories before. Now we believe them. I'm a little suspicious of that narrative because I think there's a difference between ignorance and willful ignorance. I think that anyone should have been able to understand what had been going on if they were willing to look, and maybe they weren't willing to look. Now, I think what I'm trying to outline here are the many dynamics at play when we consider something like transnational or transethnic solidarity. That on sort of at the narrative level, it's a nice narrative, you know, to say that this moment has brought people together in a way that they hadn't been brought together before. But there's also the sort of risk that, as one Chin colleague put it in response to Min Ko 9, who's one of the protest leaders from 1988, and he wrote in 2021 after the coup, he said, you know, beg the ethnics to get involved. And the Chin person said, well, you know, when things are okay for you, you'll just forget about us again. So it's really hard to credibly commit to like a trans ethnic solidarity when there are no costs to pursuing it now, but in the future you remain in power. And so some of the conversations that are occurring right now are about like deconstructing Burmanization, the idea that the Burma is hegemonic and everyone else has to, whether through language or dress or religion or just modes of conduct, would have to conform to it. It's encouraging, but one also wonders, like, how do you get past the sort of accusation that talk is cheap? Apologizing for past violations is nice, but it's not a material change. And so that's where we get into this discussion of federalism and what that actually might mean. And I think some things are, you know, some federal constitutions have been drafted that are pretty progressive, but the question is, like, will anyone believe they'll be implemented? So those are kind of some of the issues at hand. The Rohingya issue is a totally different one, unfortunately, that would probably take another couple minutes for me to touch on.
Thanks. Oh my God. Yeah, kind of think that we need more time. Julia, do you want to touch on ethnic difference in Iran?
Maybe briefly, because here I find a profound difference between the case of Iran and Myanmar. Iran is, well, given its historical trajectory, is probably more lucky in a way than Myanmar here, because even though it is home for a large number of ethnic minorities, nevertheless, we can say that there's been a remarkable cohesion between those minorities. There are jokes about different minorities in all parts of the country. They mock one another kindly, but sometimes not so kindly. But nevertheless, when it comes to the issue of national unity, rallying around the flag for a cause, for example, expressing position to a potential invasion from outside, there would be, for most of Iran's population, there would be no issue, there would be no question if they are going to get mobilized in order to protect their homeland, their fatherland or motherland, whichever you prefer. Despite even Mahsa Amini being a Kurdish woman, and large protests being held in Kurdish regions or regions where large numbers of Kurds, Iranian Kurds, live, the protests saw participation not only of the Kurdish minority, but for example, there are Baluchis, the majority, which you can say the Persian Fars majority. There was even amongst those girls shot in the course of the protest, there was Satara Tajik. She's actually an Afghan 17-year-old girl from Afghanistan, relocated to Iran some time ago, and she was also shot in the course of the protests, protesting against the government. So I think it's fair to say that we saw this cohesion in between those minorities, and thus the use of this rhetoric by the government that if Iran is weakened enough by this protest, which are of course instigated from the abroad, that's usually the rhetoric applied by the authoritarian regimes, that Iran is going to be split into various parts, the minorities are going to fall apart. Azeri Turks are going to join Azerbaijan, or going to be taken over by Azerbaijan, Baluchis by Pakistan, the Arabs in the province of Khuzestan by Iraq, and so on and so forth. I think it's used more of a as a part of this governmental rhetoric in order to prevent people from protesting rather than an actual threat. Because I mean, even if we don't consider the reasons and the aspirations of those neighboring countries in absorbing those minorities, there are caveats to each of them. For example, Azerbaijan and the Azeri minority in Iran, they have a lot of constraints and against doing that. So there is more to be said about cohesion within Iran, that I don't think there are indeed such sentiments that people want to break away from Iran and establish separate state or get together with others. There's been a Kurdish issue, long-standing, for 4 countries in the region, but I think for amongst the 4, Iranian Kurds were the most tame in a way. And they were more protesting within the framework of the Iranian state rather than demanding for example, establishment of a separate Kurdish state.
Okay, thanks. Now I know that there are 3 questions in the chat, and it is now 6 o'clock, so we've got about half an hour more. I'm just going to quickly ask the speakers: do we want to go ahead by touching on one other topic, like youth and the revolution? Or do we want to go to the questions first?
You asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you and Ali.
I was hoping that maybe someone asks the question. Maybe let's address the questions that we have. And okay. If we have time, I will be very happy to talk about the part I left out.
Okay, so I'm just going to read out the question. Usha Kula asks, how far can ASEAN assist in the Myanmar situation? For Elliot. And number 2, on Iran, how far will BRICS go towards resolving conflict zones, especially Ukraine or Palestine, seeing as Iran is a prominent member of BRICS?
Okay, yeah, I'll go first. ASEAN has traditionally been, how do they describe it? A non-interference pact. And so they tend to not be particularly active. This actually fits into the political economy point that I should have made. Like when I was talking about resource extraction, you have to sell the resources to someone. And often ASEAN has been one of the hungriest and most eager consumers of Myanmar's natural resources. So Malaysia with Petronas and its oil and gas, Thailand with pretty much everything else, from hardwoods to let's see, just pretty much everything. So ASEAN, I think they don't want to alienate a trade neighbor. Also, I think sometimes like there are certain countries that make ASEAN, like I think they make them look a little bit better by comparison. Maybe that's cynical. I think on the other hand, I think there are cases where Myanmar is just so beyond the pale that it does embarrass them, but I don't know if they would ever do anything actively. And so in terms of assisting, I don't know if they would play a very prominent role.
Julia?
Yeah, so on the second question, thank you for the question, Usha, and thank you for being here. Really happy to see you. Well, Iran actually expressed a desire to join BRICS, but it hasn't joined BRICS. I think they discussed it sometime in January to about Iran and Saudi Arabia, in fact, accepting them to BRICS. But in BRICS, the I we see in BRICS stands for India still, not for Iran. There is no double I. Maybe Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which Iran just joined, was fully accepted as a full member. It was an observer state before. But knowing that what Shanghai Cooperation Organization stands for, I don't think it's anywhere on the agenda. And for that matter, both BRICS and SCO, they include Russia. So unless there is an effort of individual states within those two platforms, I don't think that the organization as a whole is going to take any mediation effort, because Russia would be objecting to it, obviously. Same goes for Palestine, because, both have Russia as a full member, and Russia has been maintaining a very trying to maintain a very neutral position in what concerns the Middle East, being a long-standing friend of Israel, despite some souring in bilateral ties, especially with regards to Russia's connection to Iran. But again, as a platform, I don't think so. What we could see is probably China expanding its clout, its outreach, after feeling empowered by its mediation success between Saudi Arabia and Iran, although there are some nuances. Maybe China would try and take up this role, but not as not a platform as a whole, because the platform is practically, both platforms position themselves as either the countries of the global south standing against the Western liberal hegemony, or the similar group of states led by China, with Russia being a partner on that, and the rest. So their purpose, it doesn't serve their purpose, let's say.
So I can take the three questions kind of together. The questions are about EAOs, which is the ethnic armed organizations, where where the ethnic groups want to get out of this, and then Catherine asked about the federal plans. And so there's been a federal democratic charter that's been written by the government in exile, essentially. There's a number of different groups. I don't want to get too lost in the alphabet soup of them, but there's essentially a sort of a group that emerged out of the parliamentarians who were elected. And then there was a group that formed a national unity government. And then there was a sort of supraordinate group that tried to bring in ethnic groups as well to try to write this federal democratic charter. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the specifics of the charter, although I've heard that it's, it's pretty good on paper. I think one of the issues is I hesitate to use the word legitimacy, but the word of like who gets the authority to speak or to represent is, I think, a vexed one, because the NLD kind of says, well, we won the elections, and the ethnic minority groups say, well, those elections were just one aspect of what it means to be legitimate, or to be to have authority to represent us. Like in a really messed up system, and democracy, what did Churchill say? It's the worst system except for all the rest. Like democracy is not a great way of aggregating interests in a vacuum, right? People voted strategically for the groups that they thought would have a chance to win. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the people they want to govern them. And so you have ethnic minority people saying, don't take the 2021 2020 election that happened in November that was then annulled, or in the process of being annulled, as the final word on who gets to actually speak for us. And so the NUCC, I think, is a sort of attempt to try to get out of that sort of issue. But then to speak to Kinney's question, there you have these ethnic armed organizations that have long kind of spoken for ethnic people in their area, but that gets really tricky too, because in our imaginary, we have this idea of like a map being like one ethnic group in one particular area represented by one group of guys with guns. But of course, it's not really that way. Like Shan State, which is actually usually in Burmese called Shan States, or actually Shan Country, really. It's actually called Shampi rather than Shampine. That's like how big it is. It's divided into 4 different sections, and probably only has like, 40 to 60% Shan people or Dai people, depending on what you say. And as a result, you have all these weird issues of like sometimes what's called the double minority problem. And so what I mean by that is that if you're a like a Shani who lives in Kachin state, the biggest problem that you probably perceive is not Burmanization that I mentioned earlier, but it's the problem of like Jingpo supremacy. If you're Pa'o living in Shan state, it's not the Burma, it could be the Shan who are essentially trying, maybe oppress is a little bit strong word, but certainly hegemonize. Now, if you're like a Inda person, your issue is the Pa'o right above you. So it's like a sort of cascading set of maybe not oppressions, but certainly like chauvinisms. And so one of the problems is that people kind of say, well, let's address Burmanization, cut off the head of this, chauvinistic belief that, the Burma rule the country, and then everything will fall into place. But it's more complicated than that because that might not be the relevant oppression. So the Rohingya, for instance, they think Burmanization is the problem. They see it as majoritarian or religious bigotry as being the problem. And they take all the ethnic minorities and the Burma and put them in one group and say, those are the people who are oppressing us. The one thing Myanmar can agree on is that everyone hates us. And that's actually a pretty, unfortunately, cynical but effective nation building exercise to demonize and scapegoat the people that everyone hates as a way of saying, well, we might not know exactly who we are and what nationalism might mean in Myanmar today, but we know who we're not, and we're not those guys over there. And so that leads to a whole different set of questions. So to kind of just to wrap this up and to loop back to Kinney's question, I think EAOs are in a really interesting position here, where their sort of ability to speak for the groups that they claim is being challenged a little bit. And they are really kind of like having to decide, do we join the revolution or do we look out for ourselves, and what do our people actually want? And then I think the sort of final point here is the class variable that tends to always get elided in Myanmar. And that basically is that, a poor Kachin and a poor Burma have way more in common with each other than they do the elites from their group. And so every time the struggles in the country are presented as ethnic troubles, they presuppose a framework that eliminates the sort of class variable. And what's really interesting about the Anya people who I mentioned earlier, they're not really an ethnic minority. They're a group of poor Burma people who are from the countryside. You might they're akin to maybe not hillbillies, but that's like a sort of like comparison point that we might imagine. In Burmese, they're sometimes called doltu, which means like people of the jungle. Like they're looked down upon for not being as sophisticated as the rest of the people from Yangon, for instance. Now, if you tell them that they benefit from Burma privilege and that they participate in Burma Lumyo Jiwada, the sort of idea of Burma chauvinism, they're going to look at their material conditions and say, we're dirt poor farmers. We don't exactly have a whole lot of privilege, and so there's a risk of sort of reactionary and divisive sort of rhetoric if everything is reduced to ethnicity. But maybe this is just me speaking as a vulgar Marxist who believes that we have to introduce class analysis to everything. I guess to sum up, it's complicated, and ethnicity is and this is one of the situations where the term intersectionality, which we've heard a lot over the last 10 years, really, really applies. And I think the original people who made up that term really stressed class, and unfortunately in the American context, intersectionality is everything but class. But anyway, that's my little soapbox rant for right now.
I don't think you should stop there. I think there are more questions. Let's see. So next question's from Alex Henry. I'm not sure who's gonna take this, both of you. Alex Henry says, greetings from the Department of History in Nottingham. As a historian of Italian and German fascism, perhaps unsurprisingly, I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about what the study of historic authoritarian or totalitarian systems can offer those wishing to better understand Burma and Iran today.
You want to start, Julia? Because I just talked for a while.
Okay.
Yeah. I was going to propose that. I think I understood the question the other way around. Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining us, Alex. and thank you for your wonderful question. I first understood the question the other way around, rather how our study of the cases of Iran and Burma can contribute to understanding of the larger field of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I'll try to answer both, actually, because I kept thinking about the two. I'm a specialist on Iran. So I'm more for Iran and then the broader Middle East. So it's more of a regional specialization. I'm not originally specialized on, I mean, I don't look so deeply into authoritarianism, even though Iranian regime and many Middle Eastern regimes could qualify as authoritarian ones. For me, to link the two together, I mean, to seriously look at how the study of Iran figures in the study of authoritarianism is first and foremost a practical aspect, because we can see that there are still some within the international community, especially the Muslim world, that at different points had this fascination with the so-called Islamic revolution in Iran, and thought that they might be able to emulate the example of Iran. Iran was determined to export its revolution. It has this concept included in its constitution, and those other parties within the Muslim Ummah could have been fascinated. No need to go far. We are in Malaysia, and in early stages, the Islamic Party, PAS, indeed had that idea that maybe some kind of Islamic revolution could have taken place in Malaysia. Hasn't happened so far. So to me, it's the practical aspect of it is to show how much this theocratic, authoritarian regime didn't work out, and to not only to bring welfare to people, but in the long term to even though, by the way, Eliot's very socialist oriented, social welfare oriented at the start, didn't only manage to bring the welfare to the people, quite otherwise, but also to protect itself, to protect stability of the regime, which is now in shambles, the same way that its economy is. Then I also think that the two cases here, I think there's interflow of the study of authoritarianism and this country cases, and then back like as a two-way street, that it makes us think once again on this democracy bias that I think we often apply, thinking that the world is at least the hopeful ones among us look at the matter as if the world is steadily moving from authoritarianism to democracy, and eventually we are going to end up in that very bright future. But the cases of Iran or multiple others, Russia, for example, prove us wrong, and make us indeed think about, look into aspects that make, at least for some period of time, those regimes steady, and able to survive wherever they are, while at the same time, to answer your initial question, I think the study of authoritarian is not so much totalitarianism, still an authoritarian regime, but it's not a competitive authoritarianism by any means, as Iran is trying to present itself. If we talk about competitive authoritarianism, that would be Turkey, and not Iran. But if to look deep into that, despite its very complex institutional structure, the dual structure, the religious one and the non-religious one, I can't say secular, it very much fits within the parameters of an authoritarian regime. So it doesn't, apart from it being a theocracy, so it uses, as an ideology, it uses a religion instead of any other ideology that would be unrelated to religion or faith. And also, I find it interesting to observe and try to think about the cultural change that is taking place, definitely in Iran for the past several decades, this change in, as I pointed out, change in mores, change in overall emancipation of people, their demand for more, even though the better socioeconomic package would have been able to keep people at bay for a little longer, how this change has been transforming and translating into demand, which spilled over into the protests, where people tend to disregard more and more the ability of still consolidated law enforcement or coercive forces of the government to suppress the protests. So people are losing this the self-preservation instinct. That's why I quoted one of the protesters who was executed, Majid Reza Rahnavard, who said that don't cry over my grave, don't read the Quran, please celebrate my death as a harbinger of freedom that is to come. But at the same time, I think there is something for all of us to think about. What is we may often hear about Asia, especially from Asian populists, where people would say that where they would say that the leaders, especially, they would say that Asians, West or East Asia, doesn't matter, need a strong hand, need a strong man, because otherwise culturally people are unprepared to that. And there are cases that I think we can argue that that keeps being the case until people, until the society transforms into something else and actually demands for different sort of values. I hope I'm not talking too vaguely, and you could infer some kind of answer from my long speech.
So I have two questions to address, but I'd like to wrap them in together because they kind of touch on similar themes. The first is on the Alex's question about fascism, and the second one is about the Buddhist clergy. And so I'm not a historian of fascism, so I know there's lots of technical definitions that have to do with like the centralization of industry and the state and those kinds of things. But if we're taking a more kind of colloquial understanding of fascism as the sort of subsumption of all difference underneath a sort of grand leader and an exaltation of maybe race and religion, you don't really have that kind of state per se in Myanmar, mostly because the military has never engaged in a particularly ideological project. There's a really beautiful thesis written by an anthropologist named Jennifer Leahy, who studied the propaganda of the regime during the 2000s and 2010s. And she has this really provocative argument, which I wish I had made, and so I cited a lot, where she says, the propaganda of the regime wasn't designed to persuade. It was designed to remind people that they could lie to you and you had to listen to it. You didn't have to believe it, but you had to listen to it. And that's a different kind of domination. It's much blunter and it's much less kind of devoted to trying to get people to all think the same. Now, on the other hand, you have a lot of what we might call fascist elements in Myanmar, the sort of desire to subsume difference underneath a sort of blood, soil, at race, religion ideology. And that gets to William's question about the Buddhist clergy, who, as he puts it, were heroes in 2007, and you could go back and say in 88 as well, and then violent nationalists later. So what kind of explains that? It's a really vexing question that I don't think has a great answer. One way of addressing it would be that in 2007 you had well, let's just say the Sangha, the community of monks, is never monolithic, and so you have some groups, some monasteries and some sayadaws who are more progressive and are involved in the uprising today, especially in Mandalay area. And then you have some like Thiragu sayadaw who is accompanying Min Online to Russia to buy his weapons, which is not, at least my version of loving kindness, although I'm still working on my Buddhism. Thiragu is a really interesting character because he was active in the 1988 protests, and for all, he kind of became a sort of poster child for, good old peace-loving monks. And then by 2017 or 18 rather, he was giving sermons to the Defense Service Academy, telling them that it's not a sin to kill non-Buddhists. Now, the fact that this happened after a genocide was not coincidental. And the fact that it happened at the Defense Service Academy to people who would be participating in the genocide also isn't. So I think it's that he shows that people can oscillate from one position to the other depending on which allies they think are going to advance their interests, which in this case is the interests of his particular version of Buddhism. And my colleague, Matt Walton, who's written kind of a book on this, or at least addresses it on political, basically like Buddhist political thought, has written a lot about how if you have a sort of end in mind, which is protecting Buddhism, you're it's such an important end that it's almost willing, or sorry, almost will justify almost any means. And so that's how you end up getting monks who will take up arms against what they see as religious and ethnic threats. How that ends up getting transposed into monks participating in the counter-revolution is a little bit trickier, but I think probably can be justified along those lines.
Wow, okay, we've got 5 minutes left, but Alan, if I just correct me, I mean, I think I didn't quite catch what you said at the end. So what were their roles, knowing that there isn't one, and you've pointed out one particularly virulent character, but what is, as a whole, what is the role of the Sangha with the 3 years ago with the coup?
Yeah, so what I was trying to get at is that there isn't really one role. So back in 2007, it was called the Saffron Revolution. It was not a particularly, like, one joke is that it was neither saffron nor revolution. And what the joke there being is, at least how I take it, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, because I was with the activists who were doing the sort of mobilization around livelihood concerns that were relevant before what became Saffron. And so they were doing these walk to work protests that turned into this kind of like uprising. And then the monks came out to sort of protect them, which isn't to say they weren't important. It's just to say that it was always about something else. And the monks who did come out were, either maybe purged afterwards, had to go into hiding. In other words, but even so, it was a pretty small Yangon and maybe a little bit of the dry zone based uprising. It wasn't really, like, 1988 was definitely bigger, but it wasn't really until 2021 that you had like a really like country-wide uprising. And then the monks who were participating in that were quite diverse. Like some, the Sangha is quite diverse, and hence some people were participating in it as part of the revolution, and many others weren't. And so I would say, I can't really characterize the whole Sangha, but I would say that it is quite diverse in terms of who's doing what.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes. Maybe we'll just have, we'll say 5 minutes to sum up. And I don't see any more questions. So I think what I'm gonna ask is, where do we go from here? I mean, we had two topics. One was, what is the role of youth? What is so different from this younger generation? But yeah, I mean, these are continuous. So if these protests are continuing, what is the role of younger dissenters, or what's different about them? And is there space, or how prominent a role does violence play? Is violence going to tamp down the youth or the younger dissenters?
You want to go first, Julia?
Yeah, so I'm do I understand it correctly, Geek? I'm summing up and also answering the question. Yeah, okay.
2 minutes.
Whoa, that's hard. Okay, so we discussed the issue of the youth participation and that, and indeed in Iran, as well as in the Middle East overall, it's quite remarkable, because the overall population of Middle Eastern countries is 60 or more % of the total population are people 30 years old or younger, and the current protests saw participation of the Instagram and TikTok crowd. So those were people in their 20s, and indeed those executed or shot, those were people either in the early 20s or even below. We've seen the school students acting in protest as well. So it's been quite remarkable. And what's remarkable about them is that this is a generation that does not remember the 1979 revolution. So it's not constrained by the experience of that when people revolted for political rights at the time, and they didn't get quite exactly what they wanted, including the fact that they've gotten a compulsory dressing rules and the morality and the Sharia imposed on some who wouldn't want that. And they also already didn't have an experience of interacting with their parents about it, who carry this complex of guilt that the parents, that there is a bit older generation to whom their parents kept saying that that we made a mistake by this revolution, and children would shame them for that and wouldn't attempt for another revolution because they already learned within this pretty short span that the memory is still alive, that the revolution doesn't necessarily bring the desired outcome. So you need to approach it very, very carefully. And this brings me to my conclusion that I kept, as a dedicated Iran watcher, of course, I kept thinking a lot about when this change is possible, probably a revolutionary change, and what factors are supposed to be there. And that's why I brought them up in one of my slides as a revolutionary situation, because we hear in the media mostly a lot experts discussing either economic conditions or if there are any leaders, what is the leadership of the protest, while there are so many other factors. And in fact, when it comes to hard authoritarian regimes like our case, you couldn't even imagine emergence of the meaningful opposition from within the country, because this opposition will be eliminated, imprisoned at best case, dealt in many other ways. And at the same time, the leadership outside of the country is not trustworthy. Like, for example, the son of the last Pahlavi Shah, who is trying to lead the opposition, the Iranian opposition abroad, but how trustworthy they are for the people inside the country. So it's a kind of stalemate, and it reflects in the conversations that I've been having with my colleagues and friends over and over again. What's the solution to it? I think currently it reached to that boiling point where many criteria are satisfied for a possibility of the revolutions, of a revolution, although we know revolutions, it's such an unpredictable thing. They don't happen until they actually do. But what interests me after this is, even with this good quality preparation, possibly the emerging leadership which abroad, which finally will be trusted, how what's going to come out of the society's preparedness to embrace the new system, and who will take the upper hand to implement the institutional changes? What will be the plan after this? I know they are currently working on it, and hopefully, even if this drastic change takes place, it's going to go down some path towards the light at the end of the tunnel. But yeah, a lot remains to be seen about that.
So like one of the, like the sort of pithy stains and maybe a little bit of cynical sayings about a revolution is that it's also a circle, right? Like a revolution around. And I say that because in 1988, there was a revolution as well. And I just wonder how people were feeling in 1989, halfway through the year. Were they thinking that the regime was going to fall at any moment? And so maybe the hope that people feel now is, it might be misplaced. But on the other hand, it is useful to consider the past and how people keep the past perpetually in mind as they are acting now. So in 1988, the regime was able to credibly at that point say, we're going to have elections in 1990. And people look back now and say, we believe them, and we shouldn't have. But we didn't know at the time. And so now there's this sort of question of like, if the regime tried to sue for peace today, if a faction emerged within the generals who said, men online, you misplayed your hand, it's time for you to take early retirement or appropriate retirement, because I think he's 65 now. Would the revolution, to the extent that it can speak, would it accept that, right? I think if it's listening to its experiences from 1988, these aren't actors who can credibly commit to doing things that aren't in their own brutal self-interest. And so it's a really tricky situation in which people are left saying, well, if we have to fight this, not just to get to a point where we can get to peace, but we have to eradicate, and they use the word for eradication of Burmese to kind of uproot the military once and for all, because fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? In other words, if we negotiate with these guys again, we're demonstrating we haven't learned anything. So that makes the revolution that much more difficult, because you can't just get to a point where you come up with a peace solution. You kind of have to go all the way against people who've demonstrated themselves to be completely sociopathic when it comes to their willingness to deploy violence against their own people. So that part, I think, is both hopeful, because I think there's a coherence on the part of people who were in the revolution saying, like, look, we kind of know what needs to be done. We won't get fooled again. But on the other hand, it's very challenging objective to realize, because of the, as I mentioned kind of at the top, the misalignment in force, the fact that the military does have a lot of the weapons, and they keep getting them from Russia and China. I guess the one other thing to mention is that there is this really wonderful Burmese expression that calls the certain kind of soldiers a watermelon, and a watermelon is green on the outside and red on the inside. So green is in military uniform, but red on the inside, like committed to the democracy movement, whose color is red. And so for a long time, not for a long time, but for the first 2 years, there've been a steady flow of defectors. But defectors aren't all that useful, because they come to the border and then they don't have the weapons that they had. But when you sabotage a plane from inside, that becomes more destructive, both to morale and to the functioning of the military than anything else. So that's a sort of wild card that the revolution has to try to get members of the military to kind of revolt from within. So that's just like a sort of hopeful aside within a little soliloquy here that isn't all that hopeful.
Wow. We've reached the time to wrap up, and I'm just overwhelmed. I mean, I guess what we have are two scenarios that are not altogether hopeful, but there's always change, and if anything, it goes to show how much more complicated and layered things are in Burma. And I guess because of that, it's even harder. I mean, you don't even know how they can actually control the situation, which at the end of the day then makes you rethink what is authoritarianism, how much control do you really truly have to have, as opposed to what you have in Iran. And again, with Iran, you have this sort of system, this dual system, which gives this veneer of a republic and some kind of democracy, but not really. But then there's also space for civil society to emerge and to play a very active role. So I would like our participants to join us in thanking our wonderful speakers for giving us such a rich insight into the situation in both countries. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Elliot. Okay. And we have this recorded, and we'll put it up on our UoNARI Malaysia YouTube channel, if that's okay with everybody. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elliot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our kind attendees today.